Now to a bit of breeding history. The great Italian breeder and trainer Federico Tesio is considered by many to be the single most important influence on breeding in the 20th century. Chris Fife speaks with pedigree expert Jane Henning about the man they called the Wizard of Dormello.
This is Niarco, probably the most influential sire of the 20th century. And this is Rebo, perhaps the greatest racehorse of the 20th century. Niarco and Rebo had two things in common. They were both unbeaten on the track, and they were both bred by this man, the extraordinary Federico Tesio.
Federico Tesio was an outstandingly successful breeder. He had a very small band of mares and had a huge strike rate. He was an innovator. He looked at a variety of reasons why horses went wrong. He was able to control the training, the breeding, and the upkeep of his horses. He produced champions like Niarco, Donatello and Rebo, and all from such a small broodmare band.
Tesio was orphaned at an early age, but his guardian provided him with the means to travel the world. The young thrill-seeker explored South America on horseback. He broke wild broncos with the gauchos of Argentina, and he rode in steeplechases in England. Always at the centre of Tesio's adventures was the horse.
Tesio moved around the world to a great degree as a young man, and once his guardian died, he received an inheritance. And at the age of 29, he established Dormello Stud in Italy on the banks of the Lake Maggiore. His idea with the stud was to keep his mares in as natural an environment as possible. So he rotated his mares from paddock to paddock as often as he could. He sent them out to visit stallions, and he also sent them down to another farm that he had south of there for winter, so that they lived in as a natural environment as possible, as a wild horse would. With the assistance of his wife, Donna Lydia, he was able to devote himself completely to research because she was an expert on the stud book. So she did all of the administrative records for the stud and his training complex and left him completely to do research. And what he did was a lot of statistical methodology. He went back through statistics and decided where things were coming from. He went into great detail about things that perhaps modern-day trainers or breeders wouldn't be looking at, but that he felt that could be significant, such as natural patterns of migration of horses. He went for line breeding and reinforcing, special prepotent ancestors. Inbreeding, he looked for certain nicks that he thought would work and that were working already, and also sex balancing of ancestors. He also had the great advantage of being able to train his own horses, which is rarely seen today, where you can breed, own and train your own horses. So he knew those horses since they were foals, and he knew the families, he knew their traits, and by the time they were broken in, he felt that he had an intimate knowledge of that horse's own character. When they didn't really win races, he was known to be extremely hard on his jockeys and the stable boys, anyone that didn't follow instructions. And if he felt it was his own fault, he used to punish himself by fasting, abstaining from smoking. He was extremely hard on anyone that he felt was getting in the way of him producing really good horses. Niarco is one of Tesio's masterpieces. He won 14 races, was never beaten, including an Italian derby. In the pedigree of Niarco, he is sex-balanced St. Simon by putting a daughter and a son within the first 4 generations, which of course in this instance worked beautifully. He was the sire of Nearctic, who's the sire of Northern Dancer, and he was the sire of Nasrullah, who also has profound influence and is found in most pedigrees. So there'd barely be a modern-day pedigree that wouldn't have at least one line to Niarco.
The two greatest sire lines of the late 20th century both traced to Niarco. Northern Dancer was a grandson, and Mr. Prospector was a great-great-grandson on his dad's side.
Niarco is also the ancestor of Halo, Roberto and Sir Tristram. So in Australian breeding terms, you'll see that through Northern Dancer you've got Danehill, and through Sir Tristram you have Zabeel. So Zabeel and Danehill both trace directly on their tail male lines to Nyarko.
Another champion bred by Tesio was Donatello, an outstanding racehorse and a highly successful sire. Donatello appears in the pedigree of Kingston Town, as does this Tesio-bred stallion, the Goodwood Cup winner Tenerani. But Tenerani is best remembered as the sire of the dual Arc de Triomphe winner Rebo, and the story of Rebo is quite a tale. Federico Tesio was secretive, superstitious, autocratic and eccentric. But when it came to selecting thoroughbreds, there was method in his madness.
Tesio and his wife used to make an annual pilgrimage to the Newmarket sales, trying to pick up 1 or 2 broodmares a year. He did all his research before going and had a very short list of the mares that he was interested in. He would then go and inspect them, and provided they were sound, he allowed faults such as plainness or lack of race record of the actual mare. He forgave those things as long as she was from an excellent family, and he would sit in the sales ring and wait until one came up that was in his price range. So in that way he procured the dams and the granddams of Donatello and Nyarko, and he had enormous patience. He wouldn't look at another horse, and he wasn't put off by the fact that they may be unimpressive individuals themselves. He mainly wanted to breed to mares that had Derby winners in their pedigrees. He felt that classic blood was essential to produce a classic horse. But it's interesting to see that later in his life he started to waver on that strict edict, and Rebo's mother was actually a very precocious 2-year-old. She won 5 races as a 2-year-old, and she certainly wasn't his favourite mare. She was a plain mare. All of her foals coming up to Rebo were all different. They weren't very successful. He tried a few stallions, and although he had stood her Rebo's sire Tenerani at his own stud earlier, and he had now gone back to England, he decided to send her to England to be covered by Tenerani, but was concerned because both horses had highly strung temperaments.
Even though Tesio had bred Romanella and Rebo's sire Tenerani, grandsire Bellini, and great-grandsire Cavaliere d'Arpino, the master wasn't especially taken with the colt.
He was quite a plain foal. Tesio was a little disappointed in him. There was nothing wrong with him. Conformationally, he was very correct, but there was nothing outstanding about him. But one of the first things I noticed as a 2-year-old was that he was highly intelligent. He learnt very quickly, and he was unbeaten.
Rebo won all his 16 starts, including the Prix de l'Arc de Triomphe in 1954 and 1955, and he proved to be a sensation at stud.
After he went to stud, he stood 1 year in England at Woodland Stud. Then he went back to Dormello and stood 2 seasons there before there was a great big offer from America by Mr. Bred from Derby Dan Farm to stand the horse for 5 years. It was such a great offer that they decided to go ahead with it. So Rebo went to Derby Dan Farm and stood there, and they realised after a couple of years the horse was becoming very unmanageable. He had some very strange habits, including trying to climb out of his box. Apparently sire Tenerani also did that, and had a terrible temper, would throw himself about, and there was only a couple of people that could handle him. Rebo turned into a champion horse at stud as well. He produced the 4 brothers, His Majesty and Gristark. Of course, His Majesty's damn sire to Danehill now, and also the outstanding racehorses Malvado, Ragusa, Boucher, who stood at stud in Australia, and Prince Royal. So they were very anxious to keep Rebo, and at the end of the 5 years, Don Olivia wanted him back, and Mr. Galbraith didn't want to give him back. She insisted, along with her partner, of course he used to be Federico Tesio's partner, Marchesa Incisa, that the horse be returned to Dormello to stand at stud. So they actually said, we're sending 2 Italian horsemen over to accompany him on the plane back home. Now when they arrived at Derby Dan Farm, what they'd done was let Ribot out of his box into a paddock where he was tearing around madly and proceeded to try and climb a tree while these 2 Italians were watching. So they immediately decided that there's no way they could get him on a plane. So it was a cunning little trick really by Derby Dan, but they got to keep the horse there.
Tesio didn't live to enjoy Ribot's success. He died in 1954, before the champion began racing.
Tesio has left a huge legacy with the influence of the horses that he's bred and their predominance in the modern day thoroughbred. But it's also the methods that he's used that are now copied and used on a daily basis. Tesio is known as the master of matings, he's known as the wizard of Dormello, and he's certainly arguably the most influential breeder in the history of the modern thoroughbred.
Fascinating, isn't it? And remarkably, Tesio only bred an average of around 15 foals a year, yet he produced the winners of 21 Italian derbies